I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. As always, we promise robust conversations. Today, I guarantee you, will be no exception. Before we begin, I want to invite you, as I always do, to support this program, support this work. We want you to be a subscriber to this program. You do that by going to YouTube, Insight News MN. Subscribe, like, and share. Our goal is to get 1,000 subscribers, and then after that, the rest of the world. But the first step is to get 1,000, and we need you. We need you to support us and help us in doing that. YouTube, Insight News MN, subscribe, share, and like. Now, we share this program across several platforms, the Insight News YouTube platform, but also the platform of the Black Press of America, YouTube, Black Press USA. We're also on Black Press USA's Facebook page, Insight News' Facebook page, my personal Facebook page. We're streaming to Twitter and streaming to LinkedIn as well. We're trying to use as many ways as possible to connect with you. We multi-purpose the content we are creating outside of what we're doing in the live stream. We also convert these stories into newspaper articles for Insight News. And we archive them. We archive the transcripts so that they're available for the future reference. So we're having fun, actually, engaging important conversations about the topics of the day, locally, nationally, globally. And we are glad that you are part of this process. Well, today I want to have a conversation with two cool guests. One is Hajar Yazdiha. And following that, we'll be talking with Brother Stephen Stinson. Hajar has a new book. The book is called The Struggle for the People's King, How Politics Transforms the Memory of the Civil Rights Movement. It's a Princeton University Press book, and it investigates the political misuses of the memory of civil rights and Dr. King, and it tries to make sense of how distorting the past matters to our democracy today. And we'll also talk with Stephen after that about his work with the Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity. It's a group that helps manage relationships between agents and brokers in a realtor network that helps try to resolve some of the housing, the equity, the ownership problems that people here in Twin Cities face, but those problems probably exist across the country. So it's going to be a conversation that we're looking at the local and the global at the same time. At the end of the program, we'll bring both of our guests on just to share stories, motivations, what brings us to the work that we do. Well, let me start with introducing Hajar Yazdiha. Hajar Yazdiha is an assistant professor of sociology and faculty affiliate of the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California. Dr. Yazdiha received her PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's an expert in the politics of inclusion and exclusion, specifically understanding the forces that bring us together and keep us apart as we work to forge collective futures. In addition to award-winning articles, as I mentioned, she's the author of the new book, The Struggle for the People's King, How Politics Transforms the Memory of the Civil Rights Movement. And in it, she investigates misuses of the memory of the Civil Rights Movement and of Dr. King. And, she's a public scholar whose writing and research is featured in outlets including New York Times, LA Times, ABC News, The Hill, and USA Today. Dr. Yazdiha, welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me, Al.
Well, thank you for being here. Jump right in and talk about the way you have become interested in this topic of civil rights history, what that means to you, and how it's framed the work that you do, both as a lecturer, as a teacher, but also as an author now.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I am the daughter of Iranian immigrants. I was a political refugee myself. We came to the States when I was 1 year old, and I grew up in a predominantly white community in Northern Virginia. And I think it's really those experiences of being outside, of kind of looking in and coming to understand that people don't see you as kind of part of the populace, right? There's always that question, oh, where are you really from? Oh, that's a funny name. And I think it's those sort of formative experiences from a young age that always had me interested in these questions of belonging, right? What does it mean to belong? Is it just about legal inclusion? Is it just about having citizenship and a set of rights on paper, or is it about something broader? So it's really when I started reading these histories of Black thought, reading Du Bois, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Baldwin, these are really the folks who brought me to the table to rethink who I was in relationship to other people in this country, to rethink what it meant to be a non-white and non-Black immigrant. And I really think it's in this space that I start thinking about civil rights as something much more than this legal framework that all kinds of immigrants and women, LGBTQ movement, all kinds of people have picked up and used. And I start thinking about it much more as a kind of cultural symbol of belonging. So then it's really in recognizing how Dr. King's words are constantly being evoked. They're being used against the very causes that he fought for. That's really where the book's interest began. I started thinking, okay, something is going on here where he's being turned on his head.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back. Thank you for that introduction. What jumped out at me among the several things you said already, being non-white and non-Black, the question of identity. Let's explore that first. Here is a 1-year-old, and as you understand it and remember, who were you invited to be? Generally, maybe not specifically, but by being introduced to the cultural apparatus in Virginia, what was expected that you would think of yourself as you grew into personhood, first of all?
That's a beautiful question. Just thinking about the language of who I was invited to be. It never quite felt like an invitation. And I think that's something that a lot of people will relate to. I think there were always benefits to making myself very small, to making myself complicit, to making sure I kind of went with the flow. And so for me, that meant hiding away as much as I could my ethnic markers. And so, Mom, please pack me Lunchables, right? We don't need the rice and kebab that's going to stink up the lunchroom. That was me trying to do something about my frizzy hair constantly, sort of trying to seek to do all these things to minimize all the pieces of me that felt like they set me apart. There was even a moment, and of course I was already in college at this point, but after 9/11, when my parents asked me if I wanted to change my name, because of course the threat at that point was much more than just exclusion in social settings. Like the threat was real violence. Mm-hmm. And so, they asked, do you want to change your legal name so that you don't quite stick out in the same way? And I said no. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it was that at that point I had started reading these histories of Black thought. Mm-hmm. And so for me, there felt like there was resistance in just the whole schema, right? The whole idea that I would have to change something about myself. And part of that is really just the history of immigration in the country, the sort of melting pot idea that comes from the predominantly white European migration that happens in the early 1900s. I mean, that's really where we get the idea that you can just kind of be folded into the mix. Mm-hmm. And then it's really the post-1965 moment where you get all of these non-white immigrants. When we realize the limits of inclusion in this country, when we realize that inclusion, this kind of foundational ideas of us as a country of immigrants, it's all founded on white supremacy. And so if you cannot become white, if you will always be pointed out, you have these external ascriptions that make it impossible to become quote unquote fully white, then you are reminded that belonging is sort of a farce.
Do the institutions of culture that you were reared in tell you or ask you to be white specifically, or do you simply get to experience and feel and intuit that advantage comes from at least not being other than white?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think there is a social construct of the model minority. And I'm Iranian. And so typically the model minority refers to South Asian, East Asian, highly achieving, highly educated communities who have come to this country with a little bit more wealth, with a little bit more education. So it's been easier for them to take that upward mobility track. Mm-hmm. It's been very easy to use them as political pawns. to wedge groups and say, well, look, if these folks could do it, then why can't Black Americans do it? But I think for me, the actual story within my family was always one of resistance, because my parents were political activists in Iran. This is why they ended up having to leave, in the dead of night without telling anybody. They were jailed for their beliefs. They were jailed for their activism. And they really bred that in us as children, to always ask questions. And of course, it was kind of annoying as, young kids, me and my sister, who really did just want to blend in, just be normal, quote unquote, American kids, to always have our parents questioning, well, why is it that you think that's normal and you think that's abnormal, right? And these questions about the boundaries we were drawing were always present. They were always asking us questions. And when you think about being raised with a language of, oh, well, we can attribute that to capitalism, and you're 5 years old. I actually think, though it was quite annoying as a child, it was formative, because it did spark this critical thinking in me that started so early on, gave me some of the tools to make those connections, so that it wasn't quite so easy to jump on the model minority myth. I always had that kind of nagging in the back of my head that this doesn't sit quite right with me. Why should my advancement be built on somebody else's back?
So as you studied and became aware of the Black narrative, the Black story, the liberation narrative, and also the oppression narrative of Black experience in this country and in the West, and under capitalism globally, right? How have you ingested and been impacted by the study? And I'm sure this leads to the book, but how have you personally experienced the acquisition of knowledge and understanding about these relationships, the question of power and powerlessness, and the change that has been and remains afoot today?
Yeah, I think this is one of the great misconceptions of learning our history, of thinking critically, of rooting everything in the sort of historical story of power, of boundary drawing. The misconception is that if we do that, then we become victims to the past, that we somehow become stuck, that we don't take responsibility, that we don't have agency. And especially as a sociologist who is a professor, I teach classes on social movements and grassroots participation. I'm always driving home to my students that yes, when you first open your eyes to the systems that exist and just how deeply entrenched they are, it can be really overwhelming and depressing. It can make you feel like you're very small and you don't have a lot of power in the world. There isn't much you can do to change it. But the flip side of that is that once you come to understand the histories of struggle, not just in the United States, but globally, the struggles from below, from the margins, Black communities, Indigenous communities, I think that's when you realize that liberation lies in understanding the past. That's where you understand that the power of the people supersedes the power of all of these structures. So for me, it's been an emancipatory process, because it's coming to learn that, yes, these systems have kept me down. They have shaped me in all sorts of ways that I continue, into my 40s, I continue to extract from myself. It is a lifelong process. But that in that learning, in that sort of understanding that it is a journey and not just a sort of moment of you've learned it and you're done. In the journey, there's all sorts of liberation. There's all sorts of interconnectedness to other people. And I've come to see it as a lifeline.
The lifeline leads where? What future do you see as the product of the lifeline, the process, the journey that you are describing?
The question of futures is the one that really keeps me up at night. It animates so much of my recent research. Right now, I'm studying how Gen Z activists are thinking about the future, especially in the wake of COVID, in the wake of immense trauma and being dealt this horrendous hand by the rest of us, older generations, just terrible economy, terrible job prospects, the climate disaster. But at the same time, I think one of the most enlightening things, one of the most inspiring things about futures is that they really rely on a deep understanding of the past. And so again, this is really where I drive home that we cannot even imagine a future different from the one that, we're going to just have if we do nothing at all, if we don't learn the past. And I think that's one of the sort of critical ways to expand your imagination. This is the history of Black thought. This is the Afrofuturist perspective, is one that understands that if you understand the past, then you can remake the future. You can do something that's completely different from anything you could have imagined. And so that is to avoid, I think, the question of what I see as the future. And that's because I'm not really in the work of predicting. But I do think for me, there's a lot of encouragement in the fact that young people in particular are really seeing things differently. They have been dealt this horrible hand. And yet, because of it, because they are looking back and seeing that these things have been done over and over and over again, they are not yielding the results that we think they will, that they have to do something differently. And so they're thinking expansively and creatively. And I think the most important piece is they're thinking in community. And that is really the history of Black struggle is a history that's rooted in community, the power of the people, the power of relationships. So that's one that's my gospel. That's the one that I'm always going out and spreading.
So the struggle for the people's king, go into that for me.
So the struggle for the people's king is the story that roots the question of how Dr. King's memory gets invoked for example, rolling back voting rights, rolling back affirmative action. How is it that his one line about caring more about the content of your character than the color of your skin? How is it that this one line becomes his entire legacy and kind of the foundation of our collective remembrance around the civil rights movement? So it's in looking at that longer story that I go back and trace 40 years of data from 1980 to 2020. And that's really where the story emerges, that this was an intentional political strategy to distort the past, in many ways to erase it, to defang Dr. King's radical legacy, to erase and whitewash all of the context that shaped the civil rights movement and those struggles, and to use him as a symbol of colorblindness, of a free market, of American exceptionalism, and effectively to use Dr. King's symbol to roll back the very things that he fought for.
And how effectively has that been executed?
I mean, we just look at, everything that's happened in the past 10 years. One of the more, I think, surprising things that happened while I was studying the book is this was initially my dissertation project. So the data ended in 2016. But all of the data predicted the Trump presidency. So everything I was seeing about the use of civil rights memory to frame white people as the new minorities who are under threat, all of that predicted the rise of somebody like Trump. And so once I realized that, I realized the story had to come up to 2020. I had to understand what was happening in this moment and how it was going to shape the world around us. And sure enough, it does lead to this moment where affirmative action is overturned. It leads to these moments where we have this moral panic around critical race theory, where books are being banned, public libraries are being shut down. So it has been successful in ways that I don't think we ever could have imagined, because it's so easy. And I think for those of us who understand the history, it's laughable when you see Dr. King's name invoked in these situations. But when you look at 40 years of these misuses, you realize that they accumulate. Yeah.
It's like, I guess in the past couple of days, maybe you saw this on TV yesterday, I caught a glimpse of it. Donald Trump saying that he would be like Nelson Mandela. You see that?
I saw it. Yeah.
That's the example.
That's it right there. King is not the only example, right? I think it's all of these figures that have really radical histories, that have incredible power for our capacity to learn from them, to be inspired by them. Those are the ones that become most fraught. Those are the ones that are most likely to get co-opted and distorted, because the whole goal is to control the past. Because if you control the past, you control the future.
And so you talked several times about young people being dealt a bad hand. Are they saying that, or is that how you look at it? Is that a consensus anywhere? And I raise the question because I personally, I don't know if I'd use that language. I have to learn it by reading you and listening to you. But what I would describe is that, the hand that they have been dealt is the hand that's been being dealt for a long time. It hasn't changed. What has changed is our awareness of it and our ability to critically examine and to resist it differently, more broadly, and with a sense of community and a sense of shared value. And therefore, what emerges from that is the belief that change is afoot, at hand, imminent and unstoppable. That to the degree that we continue analyzing what we have and why it exists, and look at alternatives and believe that we have to author different scenarios, that we create the future among us and between us, that we have that power, right? And I think that that's the discussion I see in young people. I don't know, does that make sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense. I would say it's really both and.
Mm-hmm.
So it is both that there are absolutely these tools for understanding it that we didn't have in quite the same way before. We have larger scale analyses. We even have the prospects of big data,
Mm-hmm.
which make it possible to look at everything from an eagle's eye view in ways that maybe we couldn't before. But another part of it is that the economy has changed in fundamental ways. Technology has changed in fundamental ways that do change the context, that also make it a worse hand. And so by that, I mean the fact that you could even look at the prospects of a 9-to-5 job with living wage, stable benefits. This is one of the things that we lose, sort of in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
So once everything kind of gets restructured, new technologies come in that replace factory work, that replace humans, then you really don't quite have the same prospects of having a livable wage, being able to live a good life, take care of your family, have a roof above your head. Housing costs have accelerated. I mean, in so many ways, we could think about all the ways that it's not just a question of inflation, that things have completely separated. The wealth gap is immense now. And so it's much harder to make up for some of the gaps that have been created.
But it demands that we look at the question of wealth itself and distribution of wealth, and we have to put the brakes on the collection of wealth into fewer and fewer hands. Wealth being power at the same time. Well, let me ask you about your Iranianness. And you mentioned that your parents were political people who escaped the country to this country. You were a year old. How do you look at your family's history, their political experience and activism, and what is your connection to what's happening now in Iran? And that's particularly interesting because I'm believing that all of that is informed by your study and by your work as well. So what's the connection between the liberation movement that you're studying, the narratives that you are describing of African people, of Black people in America, and the political upheavals happening all around the world? How are these things connected from your point of view? Are there connections?
Yeah. The struggles of the people, as I see it, are always interconnected, if not in terms of geopolitical histories, at least in terms of the kind of tools, the theories, the ideologies that go behind rising up from below. For me, it was interesting because I know a lot of Iranian diaspora in the United States came from the sort of history of the revolution. Many of them were involved in some way. The difference, I think, with my parents is that they're truly free thinkers in every sense of the word, where they kind of refused to take a hard line against the government once they were here. There are a lot of Iranians here who speak out regularly against the regime over there. Mm-hmm. My parents actually have more of a perspective that oftentimes the work we do of performing our outrage about Iran is used in the service of imperialism over there. And so for them, it's much more of a nuanced question of, whose voices are being amplified. So I've actually been really reluctant to take a strong line myself. And that's in part because I've never been there. Mm-hmm. I have never lived in Iran. I have never had the joy of stepping foot in my homeland. And I think that...
Do you have a sense of your personal genealogy? Do you have a story in your heart about your parents' parents and their parents and their parents, some way that connects you to your cultural lineage and identity?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking the deep questions, Al, because I'm like, we could do a whole therapy session right now. This is something that comes up a lot for me because I'm somebody who's always out here talking about how we need to know our collective history. Mm-hmm. I don't know a lot about my personal history. Mm-hmm. And I do think there's a story of refugees in this country that is shaped by trauma, if we're honest about it. Mm-hmm. I think there is a limit to just how much certain families are willing to share about the past and about where their children come from. But the cultural history is always strong. I mean, it's shaped everything from, the way that I approach social settings, right? The idea that I'm always more concerned with other people's comfort before my own. The question of tarof, this tradition where you're always concerned with other people, having before you have. And I think that spirit of collectivism, there's sort of underlying idea that you should bring warmth into everything that you do. It's inextricable. It is part of my identity. I think it always will be. But I also think there is something unique about the way that my parents think, the way that they themselves, even within Iranian political spaces, have always understood themselves to be outsiders because they refuse to have sort of hard categories around, oh, we're Marxists, we're progressive. Like all of these titles we like to put on things for them don't stand because they're, in their mind, used in the service of division. They've always been instilling in me the power of humanity. And so we could talk about how that is cultural, but I also think there's something that supersedes it. And that's really where I connect to the histories of Black struggle, because I think they're also related to a deep and unabiding kind of understanding of our shared humanity, of a human dignity, and the power of that across all borders.
I love that. Thank you so much. Hang out with me for a minute. I want to bring in my next guest, Stephen Stinson. Different conversation, but at the end of the day, it's all the same conversation. And it's about, as you just said, dignity of human beings, our shared commitment to celebrate our lives and our contributions as fellow human beings. Stephen, welcome to the program. Thank you for being here. Let me introduce you with a note here. You are a junior loan officer with an organization called Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you help manage relationships with agents and brokers through the organization's realtor network. You've got a unique set of skills and a passion for building equitable communities. You used to work at Wells Fargo. You were a home mortgage consultant, helping families from all walks of life to purchase or refinance their homes. And you've been a small business owner. You've worked in local politics doing outreach and managed a city council campaign for Ward 3 in Minneapolis. And, the underlying theme for all your work is community. Your notes say you love building relationships with potential home buyers and partnering with realtors to help families achieve their dreams of homeownership. So let's do Twin Cities Habitat 101. Talk about the organization, what it is doing, what it seeks to do, and why this work is important right now in Twin Cities, and how this fits into discussion about wealth building for individuals and families across the country. You have to unmute, Stephen, unmute. There should be a mute button that at the corner there. There we go. Got you. Okay.
There we are. And I'm a millennial, so I should know how to use this technology. So my organization is Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity. I'm going to recenter this guy right now. And the mission here is just to bring people together. We try to create, preserve, and promote affordable homeownership and advance racial equity in housing. We do this a couple of ways. Through my organization, we have several different arms that work in different areas of the community. So firstly, we try to empower people to achieve their dream of affordable home ownership, and that's through our lending arm, which is TCHFH Lending, Inc. And the lending arm of Twin Cities Habitat has a visionary mortgage program that is available for low to moderate income home buyers to give them that chance to achieve their dreams. In addition to that, we also stabilize. We have a we do this through trying to preserve those homes, right? And home preservation means that people may be able to take advantage of some programs at Habitat to do repairs, right? And also to do some foreclosure counseling, right? So it's not just getting people in the homes, but we stabilize those homes and that home ownership through another branch of our organization. And most people may know our organization from building, right? We have an international reputation of actually building homes. That means from the ground up. We have teams of people and volunteers out every single day working on projects across the 7-county metro here in Minnesota to build affordable housing. Finally, we do a lot of advocacy, and advocacy takes place on both the local and federal levels, right? We try to raise our voice to make other people, especially those in positions of power, aware that public investment is necessary to keep affordable homeownership and to keep those dreams alive for families across our state. But on the federal level, this awareness then can trickle through other communities across the country. So we're pretty proud of the work that we do here at Twin Cities Habitat, and it's been a real joy to work here.
The last recession served as a ringer, pushing, eliminating Black wealth, primarily through our people getting caught in bad mortgages, and we lost wealth as a community. What's the status of Black wealth, Black home ownership, as you know it right now in Twin Cities or in the country? I don't know, you've studied the data, but I think you may know the numbers. What's the status, and what's the imperative? What's the challenge that requires the work that you do?
Sure. So in the country, as many people are aware, the rates of home ownership between persons of color, between Black Americans and their white counterparts is huge, okay? And in no place is this disparity more prevalent than here in Minnesota. Unfortunately, Minnesota does have one of the highest rates of home ownership in general, but one of the lowest for persons of color and specifically Black Americans. And so there's a lot of work to be done here.
What explains that?
Sure. So Minnesota has a history of racial covenants in housing. So specifically, there were at one point in time, I'm just going to refer to a little note here. And there's a project actually at the University of Minnesota. It's called Mapping Prejudice that has a lot of information about this. But there were covenants written into home ownership, into the deed itself, that prevented white homeowners from being able to sell their properties to persons of color, to Black Minnesotans, as well as to the Native population. And so the history of the gap in home ownership here in Minnesota can trace its roots back to those covenants, which were actually on the books in the early 1900s. And although practices such as those were outlawed in the mid-century, on the ground, that's not the reality. And so people still specifically targeted other white homeowners to sell their properties to and disregarded the needs of the communities of color.
So in part then, institutions, programs like Habitat for Humanity respond to that historic inequity, right?
Absolutely.
And so then describe the vision. You gave it once, but give it again, how the vision of the organization directly confronts that racism and that exclusion that is one of the byproducts or the objects of racist policy.
Certainly. So here at Twin Cities Habitat, we're actually taking advantage of a tool that lenders can use called a special purpose credit program. Now, a special purpose credit program targets a specific block of the community to allow them to take access to some of our funding. So in this case, our special purpose credit program, which is still in its pilot phase, so we're going to be going live with this pretty soon, but we have had some families be able to take advantage of this currently. But the special purpose credit program here at Habitat targets foundational Black Americans and allows for them to have access to not only the lending product here at Habitat, but also it comes with a few extra, I want to say, specialized tools to specifically target the needs of foundational Black Minnesotans. And so here in Minnesota, that's going to mean access to, some additional subsidized financing. It can mean access to some lower better terms is what I was meaning to say. In addition to that, our program does take advantage of a wide variety of subsidies, subsidized financing. And subsidized financing allows people to purchase a home that they may otherwise not be able to afford. Foundational Black Minnesotans here, they have to trace their lineage back to the original sin here of American enslavement. And through that, we can identify people to take advantage of the program and then help them achieve their goal and try to reduce that home ownership gap, which I said before, in Minnesota, it's pretty wide. And earlier, Al, you did mention that there's a wealth gap, and the wealth gap is driven in part by the home ownership gap, right? And so by closing that home ownership gap, we close the overall wealth gap. There's another interesting thing that happened here just recently in the last few years, and that is, people being able to take advantage of refinancing during the lockdowns, during a time in which we had historically low rates. Well, unfortunately, Black Americans, persons of color, as well as low to moderate income borrowers, they were denied refinancing. Half the time, 3/4 of the time, compared to their white counterparts. And what this does,
meaning white people got to refinance at 3%, 2%, 3.5%, good mortgages, right? Down from 10, 9, 7, and Blacks were denied again. And when we get considered, it ends up being 7, 8, 9, 10, 11%.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Refinancing means instant equity in your home. And so when we were unable to refinance, I think we'll find in the next few years that the gap in wealth, which of course is driven in part by home ownership and the equity people have in their homes, it's just going to blow up a little bit more. And so the widening of that gap means organizations like mine, as well as other nonprofit lenders and also for-profit lenders, are going to really have to step up here to talk the talk, but also walk the walk and decrease this gap and get more Black families and families of color and low to moderate income families into home ownership.
So my thing, Stephen, is that businesses in general, white people in general, as a group, as a construct, don't do right because it's right to do right. They do right because they have to. They have no choice. And so what will need to be created in terms of pressure from within the Black community to force outcomes that free us, that give us equity, that give us opportunity that we've been consistently denied and locked out of. How do you see us navigating the near term, 3 years, 4 years, when we're in a less favorable economic environment with interest rates high? How do you see us getting around that? What do we do? What levers can we pull to ensure that we don't keep sliding back, but can even now move forward in building wealth individually and as a community?
Sure. So firstly here, I'm going to go back to that advocacy piece, because this is going to be key to reducing that gap here in Minnesota. And so we're going to need active participation in communities to not only force their local representatives to actually address these problems, but realize that the power is in the people being able to replace said representative if they do not do the people's business, right? And so we're going to need more advocacy, right? We're going to need people to participate locally in their local elections and to really come together in order to address these issues. Like, no one person can do it. No one organization can do it. Also, we need more education. Organizations like mine exist to serve the community, and we do so, just like I said before, in a number of different ways. But unfortunately, awareness just isn't where it needs to be. And so we need to make others aware that organizations like Twin Cities Habitat exist and that they can take advantage of a lot of these programs. Awareness, education, and finally, people are going to have to get mad a little bit, right? People are going to have to get mad a little bit. And I think that ties back to education, because a lot of folks just aren't aware of the disparity, right? Once you see the numbers and you're aware that in Minnesota, white homeownership is at 77%, whereas Black homeownership is at 30%, right? That should get people pretty riled up. And so we try to educate the community, spread that awareness, and promote advocacy to fix what is a pretty big problem at the moment.
You were a small business owner. What business did you own? What did you do in business?
Sure. So for a while there, I was actually I had a small business that provided services, entertainment services, actually to local establishments. So we did, we put together high school proms, we did local weddings, we did corporate events, that kind of thing.
And your notes say that you were managing a city council campaign in Ward 3. Tell me about that. What was your experience? What happened?
Sure. So here in Ward 3 in Minneapolis, Ward 3 is pretty much the economic engine of the Twin Cities. I'm sorry, of Minneapolis specifically. Ward 3 encompasses a lot of the downtown area. It's got a chunk of Northeast Minneapolis. It also has some of the major sports venues in Ward. So a lot of revenue is generated. Actually, I'm sorry?
Which campaign were you on?
Sure. So I managed a campaign for my sister-in-law. Her name is Samantha Stinson. And Ward 3's race at that time was to replace Jacob Fry, who then went on to become mayor of Minneapolis. And so there was a lot of action in the Ward 3 race. Actually, at the time, Ward 3 broke the record for campaign spending of any Minneapolis City Council race in history, which was pretty interesting. We ran as a scrappy underdog, and I'm very proud of the work we did. One thing that was interesting during that campaign was I physically knocked on probably every single door in the ward and got to know the community pretty good at that time. This was in 2016, 2017. And so there was a lot of worry about not just the local election, but also what was happening in national politics. And so it was a real education and snapshot of the city in general.
Do you see the city, the residents of our community, more hopeful or less hopeful right now? And do you see our people or people in general being more prone to be politically active, to be active around issues of equity, issues of wealth building, issues of education, and of the environment? How's it look? What's the lay of the land? What's your take on the barometer of the people right now?
Sure. There's a lot of pessimism. I will say that there's a fair bit of that. But also, there are professionals out there who are trying to bolster these communities. I'm a member of several different organizations, one being the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, whose goal is not only to provide services for people, but also to do that education. And so, on the ground here, I think that a lot of people are afraid. They see the mortgage rates spiking. People who thought that this was their year to purchase a home, and now that they see the rates topping 7-8%, they're having a lot of shock, right? And realizing that now might not be the time that they achieve those goals. And so, there's a lot of fear out there. There's a lot of fear based in mortgage rates, but also just in inflation, and then instability nationally when it comes to our elected officials. And so this is a time that organizations like Twin Cities Habitat and others across the country really are going to have to reach out into those communities and let people know that what they're seeing and hearing. There's a lot of fear, right, in media, and those sorts of things need to be combated, right? We need to combat those narratives by letting people know that there's a path forward, and that together we can achieve.
Are you a native Minnesotan?
No, actually, I'm originally from Chicago, but I did graduate from Edison High School right here in Northeast Minneapolis.
What's your family lineage?
Family lineage. This is one of those questions that hits deep. Well, both sides of my family can be traced back to American enslavement. My father's side of the family traces its roots back to Mississippi area, and then my mother's side traces their roots back to The furthest we could get is Ohio when they resettled after enslavement ending. And so I come from, my family story is not dissimilar from other foundational Black Americans. Neither one of my parents actually own their own homes. And so I'm a first generation and first time home buyer, which is definitely breaking a cycle that a lot of foundational Black Americans find themselves in. And so, having a history that, again, is unfortunately pretty typical for foundational Black Americans. I think that we have, me and my family, as well as the community at large that I consider myself a part of, we got some deep roots here, and we're trying all we can to break cycles, break historic norms, and get people where they envision themselves, and that is to be home buyers.
Let's bring Dr. Yazdiha back in for the balance of the program. She's been monitoring the conversation in the green room. And I wanted to have you and she talk about this question of foundational. You've used that term, and it's a term that is really finding, utility. You specifically said there are programs that use that language to identify beneficiaries of resources and opportunities. What do you mean by foundational? And let me hear what your thoughts are about that. And as you say foundational, in your mind, it's foundational as opposed to what?
Sure. Is that a question for me, Al?
That's for you, Stephen. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Foundational Black Americans, they typically can trace either side of their family back to enslavement. But also it's a way to self-identify too, right? And so we need to allow people the space and freedom to self-identify as a foundational Black American. That's if they choose to do so.
Okay, and so does it suggest Black American as opposed to an immigrant from the Caribbean or from Africa that is in the generations beyond legal slavery, legal enslavement?
Well, it absolutely can, because people who can trace their lineage back that far, or who consider themselves foundational Black Americans, they have been subjected to some harms, right, both on the national and local levels that other communities just haven't been. And so we're trying to address some of those historical traumas that are specific to this segment of the population.
Hajar, what's your research giving you in terms of monitoring this conversation about foundational versus Pan-Africanist? Is there a philosophical difference or delineation of what it means to be Black in America when we start using terms like foundational, or what's the other term that's used? There's a term we're using a lot here in Minnesota, Stephen, but it's not foundational, it's ADOS. African descendants of slavery, or African American descendants of slavery. So I'm wondering how that discussion is playing out. Are you hearing that, reading it, Hajar?
Yeah, no, I think I've actually been learning a lot through this conversation. So really, thank you both. I think it's interesting because to me, foundational feels like a bit of a reclamation, right? And so when I initially heard it, I thought, okay, yes. I mean, when we're thinking about, for example, the 1619 Project with Nicole Hannah-Jones and the idea of writing Black Americans back into the founding of this nation, the founding was built on their backs. It was built with their sweat, blood, and tears, with their soul. And so when you think about it in that way, I mean, I think foundational, even beyond sort of being a policy term, right, it also has this political language to it that feels valuable. I can also see, though, how, there'll be questions about, well, how do we draw boundaries around that, especially if it comes to the redistribution of resources. I'm all about abundance, so the more we can include everyone who's sort of affected directly by anti-Blackness, of course, I think that that's ideal. But to me, it sounds like there is a history here. And as I said, I'm learning. I'm going to go and read some more about sort of the history of the term and how it's situated. And it seems like a valuable conversation to have.
Any comments, Stephen?
Yeah, certainly. Just to add that, Black Americans who can trace their lineage all the way back to enslavement, just realize that their forefathers, their ancestors built wealth in this country for other people, right? And that original sin of enslavement and that forced labor, right, really set the foundation for what we see today. So I just want to acknowledge that people in these situations, their forefathers built the country from scratch.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. And I would love to just add in that, even thinking about the conversation you were having earlier, thinking about, how these benefits have been given to white Americans over time. It reminded me of the fantastic book by the historian Ira Katznelson called When Affirmative Action Was White. And of course, it's a bit of a misnomer since affirmative action is intended to repair past harms. But it does show this history of how white Americans at every turn have received these resources and these benefits. If you want to use the political language of handouts from the state over and over and over again. And so when we have a conversation, for example, about reparations, sometimes you'll hear a critique like, well, I don't want a handout. And it's, no, this is what is owed to you, right? So this is the debt that the country owes you. So anyway, just to say, I appreciate the work you're doing.
So let me have you both consider this. When and as we draw boundaries of definition, maybe this is an either or both and, not an either or, ought we be also mindful that the perpetrators of the inhumane treatment of people enslaved were not just in the US boundaries, but in Europe and other parts of the world, but primarily Europe. And the expression of this exploitation, this extraction of wealth and exploitation of human beings occurred out of the depopulation of Africa and the movement of Africans to North America, the Caribbean, and South America, and in small amounts to Europe. But the massive, transatlantic slave trade puts us all in a relationship with the beneficiaries of that process. And do we limit ourselves or let people off the hook if we don't have an eagle's eye view of the entire process? I say that because we also have technology that allows us to communicate with each other differently all over the world. And one of the hallmarks of the past experience was their ability to segregate us physically and our thoughts and our awareness to their advantage. And that was a control mechanism. That is changing. And can we both recognize and utilize the capacity to change to forge a different relationship between ourselves and the rest of humanity, and in ways that protect us from the ravages of the Pax Europa, is what I call it, Europe's exploitation of Africa and the Americas. What do you think, Dr. Yazdiha?
Oh, sorry, I already have.
Whoa.
No, this is like a really complex but important question.
Your sound is warbling now. I don't know if something happened differently, but your sound is tried again.
So this is a really complex question. And for me, a big part of this.
Hold on, bad sound. So take out, I don't know if you can do anything different with your microphone.
Can you hear me?
Perfect now, better.
Okay, thank you. So this is a really complex question. And I think a big part of it is how much do we want to focus on the reparations piece and how much do we want to focus on the power simply of truth telling? And for me, it's always been both, because I do think the redistribution of resources is critical. I don't think that you can do it. You can't really repair. You can't do any of the work of reconciliation without it. But I also think critical to this process is also the work of reckoning. And one of the great recognitions in the book is, we never really had a reckoning. And so even with the gains of the civil rights movement. There was never the recognition of past harm. It was the sort of story that President Reagan signs, the King holiday into law. And as he's doing so, he thanks Dr. King for lifting the burden of racism from this country. And so it's this revisionist story where racism ended with the civil rights movement. We've moved into the post-racial era. And so reckoning doesn't take place. And so when we think about just how deep the story simply in America goes, and then you think about it in a global perspective, well, I don't know that I feel particularly hopeful that we'll ever have a collective reckoning around just how deep those roots run. But I do think that the process of truth telling can also be a local process. And that's actually where I see some promise in these connections that you're talking about. I think when we look at the histories of the communities where we live, when we look at even the streets where we live, what is the history of housing? Thinking about Steve's work, right? Why is it that my neighborhood looks a particular way? Why is it that the housing values are so different from the neighborhood just, a couple blocks over? So I think some of these deeper questions about, community, our local histories, our local reckonings can actually be a pathway toward a more pragmatic way to approach redistribution, to think about the failures of the state, right? Even thinking again about Steve's work. I mean, this comes out of the failure of a national safety net, right? In the absence of a safety net, we end up with all sorts of nonprofits that have to come in to fill the gap. And yet, I think there's something beautiful about the community that Steve's creating. He's doing something that's actually quite radical. And so I think there's still value in it. And so that's a very, kind of long-winded way to say that I think that the global story is important. It's one that we have to talk about. But I also think when it comes to the concrete steps that we take to move forward, it's got to start in our backyard.
Stephen?
Well put. I think too, some of the historical failures, that of Reconstruction, that of reconciliation, right? Those failures were a part of what ended up being just a bargain, right? And one of those bargaining chips, unfortunately, that was left by the wayside is the value and the progress of Black Americans of the time. That trickles down to where we are today. I think your point, though, about being more connected now than ever is salient in that our organization is international. And so the message and the mission that we try to bring, we're spreading that all over the place. There are habitats for humanity in every pocket of America and then scattered throughout the world. And so we definitely are an organization that tries to push more information out there so that we can achieve some of our goals in different parts of the world.
Listen, guys, this has been a wonderful conversation. Let me ask you both if there is a book you're reading or a saying that you want to share with our viewers and subscribers that give them something to think about beyond this conversation. Dr. Hajar, first you. Do you have an inspiration or a word or a book, or besides your book? Your book is first,
besides
right?
my book.
Yeah.
Yes. I think just in the midst of so much devastation globally, domestically, for me, the quote that keeps me going is the one from Dr. King, where he reminds us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So we have to keep going.
And take a minute to invite people to buy and read your book.
Yes, please. You can find my book anywhere that books are sold. Amazon, if you like indie bookstores, bookshop.org is fantastic. And you can also find me on social media.
Thank you so much. Stephen, a thought, a quote, or an idea?
Sure. So thank you, Hajar. I'll definitely be checking out your book. It sounds utterly fascinating, and I appreciate the invitation to check that out. Let's see. I'm reading kind of Afrofuturism. So I read a lot of N.K. Jemisin at the moment. There's a book called How Long Till Black Future by N.K. Jemisin that I think is pretty outstanding. I didn't prepare a quote actually for this. I didn't know that you'd be hitting me with that one, but definitely the works of Dr. King are an inspiration, and there's a real depth to his knowledge. And so I would say for people who aren't familiar to read Hajar's book and also do a little research.
Yeah, I'd love to have you both back to talk about Afrofuturism. I think that's an important conversation. So would you be available? And maybe look at the book that you just recommended and other things in that genre. Thank you both so much for being here. I appreciate you, and this has been a delight for me.
Thank you. Likewise, it's been amazing.
All right.
Thank you, Al. Thank you, Hajar.
I'm Al McFarlane. This was The Conversation with Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time.